Good morning. So let's continue from yesterday. Maybe it's a good idea to start with the main takeaway from yesterday, which is that we found a way to basically sample a random matrix or a random lattice together with a trapdoor. And this trapdoor allows us to invert our two favorite one-way functions. Okay, so today we'll see how to use these ideas to get interesting applications. All right, so applications. So before I begin, a quick word about notation. Different speakers are using different notation with regards to like the LWE sample. So some people assume row vectors by default or column vectors by default. Some people have their matrix A to be short and fat, others have it to be tall and thin. So the notation varies a little bit. In particular, my notation varies a little bit from Hotek's notation yesterday, but it's all the same thing. The only thing to remember is that the vector S in the LWE sample is going to be multiplied on the short side of the matrix A. So that's the only thing to remember. Okay, so today we're going to start with an application called identity-based encryption. And this is a form of public key encryption, but it's an encryption scheme in which any arbitrary string can be your public key. So this is something which takes some getting used to. At least it took me some time to get used to this idea. Your public key can now be anything that you want. So in particular, it can be your name, it can be your email address, it can be just any string at all, right? And this is very useful because, well, one thing is that it's just cool to have. You don't have to remember like a long string of random looking digits for your public key. It can be whatever you want. It also prevents like scams from certification authorities and so on. But we're not going to get into any of that. So what we'll be interested in is just how to construct this object and why it is non-trivial. And my plan for today is to cover identity-based encryption and a generalization of it, which is called attribute-based encryption. But what we'll do is we'll go slowly. It's, I think, really important to understand the proof ideas in these constructions, and they tend to be pretty, they tend to take some time. So we'll spend a lot of time on IBE, and then if time permits, we'll also do ABE. That's the plan. As usual, feel free to stop and ask if there are any questions along the way. So this is the basic schematic of how an IBE works. Okay, so in this system, as I already said, you can have any old string be your public key. So for instance, we have our favorite characters, Alice and Bob. The public key of Bob is bob@iitm.ac.in. And Alice can just, encrypt her message to Bob using this as his public key. Okay, now Bob, of course, needs to be able to find, a secret corresponding to his public key. He needs to have a secret key. So in order to do that, he contacts a key server. This key server contains some kind of master secret as well as some public parameters, and authenticates Bob. Checks that it's indeed Bob, using his driving license or something, and then returns a secret key corresponding to this string, right? And then once Bob receives this private key, he can decrypt the message that Alice sent, and he can reuse this key for the rest of time. So it's not that he needs to contact the key server and get a key every time somebody sends a message, but he'll get it once, and then, now he has a secret key, and this will work for the rest of time. So the main difference is that the public key can be arbitrary, and in order to derive a secret key for a given public key, so for your email address, you want to have a secret key, you need to go to a key authority who's going to have a master secret and give you the corresponding key for your ID. Is the model clear? Okay, so this is what it looks like in terms of algorithms. Okay, so we have, as usual, like a setup type algorithm, which will take a security parameter and output some public parameters. Then there's going to be a key generation or extraction algorithm, which is going to take as input the master secret key. right, as well as an identity, and it will output a secret key corresponding to the identity. The encrypt and decrypt are as usual, so except that they use this new public-private key pair. Okay, so this is just the basic schematic of what an IBE looks like. And a little bit of history about this problem. Okay, so this was posed as an open question by Shamir in 1984. And it stayed open for quite a while. The first solution was presented by Bonnet and Franklin, and they really kind of crucially used algebraic properties of something called pairings, which we are not seeing in this workshop because they're quantum broken in particular. But this was a big open problem, and I'll try to, during today's talk, give a sense of what it is that makes this object hard to construct. Okay, so the first solution uses pairings. I also want to mention that, much later, there was a really beautiful solution that only uses the computational Diffie-Hellman problem. This was by Dotling and Garg, and, Nico is here. You can ask him to tell you about this. So this is a sort of a significant weakening of the assumption of pairings. Today, what we'll see is, of course, a solution from lattices. That's why we've been building up all this machinery, right? And before we advance towards constructing a solution, I'd like you all to think about what might be the big challenge here. So, what we've seen so far is a public key encryption scheme, right? We saw Regev's public key encryption scheme. And we also saw that it has nice homomorphic properties, and you can use it to build homomorphic encryption. And now I'm trying to convince you that identity-based encryption is a completely different object. So it's something which requires one to overcome a completely different set of challenges. So let's forget about homomorphic encryption, because homomorphism is not something that's going to be super useful right now. But just start from public key encryption and tell me what you think is the main challenge in going from public to identity-based. Yes?
So normally you have a secret.
One moment, maybe.
So probably the main challenge is that normally you have a secret key, and from that you compute the public key. And here it's the other way around. And as we've seen yesterday, we'll probably use some trapdoor to do that.
Okay, so that's a pretty good intuition. So the idea was that usually you think of having a secret key and then computing a public key from that. So this may not always be exactly true, but it's certainly true in many cases. And in the trapdoors from yesterday, for instance, we saw that first we picked the trapdoor R, and then we constructed the matrix A using it. So that's pretty good intuition. Any other ideas? So let's go back to this picture. Okay, so what we see here is that, the setup algorithm, it only outputs some sort of public parameters, right? And if I think of kind of mapping in my head, a public key for every identity, right? So let's think of all of us in this room, and let's just say that all of our first names are public keys, right? Now, you would need intuitively some mechanism for mapping this name to a legit public key, right? And the problem is going to be that, these public parameters have to be announced ahead of time. They cannot depend on any identity, right? Because the setup algorithm, it just has to output a public key that works for everybody. But there can be an exponentially many possible public keys inherent in the system, because everybody's identity is a public key. Does that make sense? So one of the main technical hurdles in this, and I'm hoping that we'll really see this challenge in action today. One of the main technical hurdles is a question of compression. You have these short public parameters. From this, you need to somehow, right, during both extraction as well as during encryption, right? Both of these take an identity ID as well as this public key. You need to be able to somehow map these short public parameters to, an arbitrarily large set of public keys somehow. And this compression is actually at the heart of what makes an IBE so hard to construct. I know that this is vague, but let's spend a little bit of time on it. We'll see how this challenge comes up in the constructions and how this challenge is solved. Are there any questions? Okay, so as I said, the main challenge, there are, multiple ways of looking at it. One way that was suggested that also is a big problem. And another thing is this question of compression. Okay, and I'd also like to ask you, so when I showed you the schematic here, I said that there's a master secret key that the setup outputs, and this extraction or key generation algorithm takes the master secret key and the identity and then generates a secret key for any given identity, right? So can anyone tell us why it's sort of inherent that you need a master secret? One of the reasons that I also want to talk about this is that this master secret is a source of a lot of criticism in the community. Because if I think of a public key encryption scheme, right, I can generate my public and private key, and I alone can have access to whatever data is encrypted towards me. But the master secret key in an identity-based scheme is powerful enough to decrypt anything in the system. So, if one of us, let's say, Rio has the master secret key, then he can actually open all the messages encrypted for any of us. And this is obviously not good. I mean, we like Rio, but we don't want him to read our secret communication, right? So this is the problem. So why is it that we need it? What do you think? Yes?
After the setup, without the master secret key, there would be only the public parameters, and everybody could decrypt things.
Absolutely. So that's exactly the reason why, right? So because if you did not have any master secret, then anybody could derive the key for anybody, because now, these keys are just identities, right? And if my identity is known to you, which it should be because you want to send me messages, and there is no secret that is used to derive the key, the secret key, then anybody can derive my secret key, your secret key, and so on. So what he said is exactly right, that there's sort of an inherent need to have some sort of root secret which allows you to derive the secret keys of all the other identities in the system. So you can think of this as like the root identity, like the null string or something, and this will allow you to give secrets for all the other identities in the system. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight these couple of things because they're important. We'll talk more about them. Okay, so now let's see how to define security. Okay, so now security also becomes much more non-trivial to define as compared to any old public key encryption scheme. So in public key encryption, how does security work? You have, what is the definition, right? So you have a challenger and an attacker, and the attacker receives the public key. The challenger submits two messages, M0 and M1. I'm sorry, the attacker submits two messages, M0 and M1. The challenger will pick one of them at random, encrypt it, and send it back to the adversary. And the adversary has to guess which of the two messages was encrypted. Okay, so this is called an indistinguishability style game. So the idea is to capture the intuition that the ciphertext does not leak anything about the underlying message. So note that in this, this challenger-adversary game, which I just described to you, the adversary has everything except the single bit B. You see that? So the adversary has the public key. The adversary has both the messages M0 and M1, right? And the only thing it does not have is the bit B. So the challenger is giving me, the attacker, a ciphertext which encodes the challenge message. And the only thing I don't know is the bit B, and if I guess the bit B correctly, so note that I can always guess it correctly with a probability half, but if I guess it correctly with better probability than that, then this is considered as an attack on the scheme. Okay, so now, is that clear? Any questions? So just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen that game before, the one I just described? Okay, good number of you, so that's great. Okay, so now we have to, generalize this to identity-based encryption. So here also, the attacker is going to sort of receive a public key from the challenger. But in this game, one particular difference is that we're going to ask the attacker to submit the challenge identity. So now note that there aren't just challenge messages M0 and M1. There's also a challenge identity. There's an identity for which the challenge ciphertext should get created, right? Because that's the key thing in an IBE. So the challenger is going to receive the challenge identity over here, right? It will then return the public key to the attacker. And now this is a very key difference from basic encryption. The attacker can request the challenger for multiple keys corresponding to different identities. And why is this a meaningful scenario? Because in the real world, if I'm an attacker, right, and let's say that I want to attack the ciphertext for some particular person, let's say Alice, okay? In that case, I could certainly gang up with 10 other people. We could pull together the keys corresponding to our own identities. Note that this is meaningful because all these keys, including the target Alice, all our keys are derived from the same master secret. You see, so the reason that this type of situation does not arise in public key encryption is that there, each person's public and secret key is derived completely independently. So even if 50 of us get together and try to break some other person's key, we have, 50 is as good as none because it's all completely independent. But here, all the keys are derived from the same master secret. So one has to account for the possibility that different keys are leaking some information. Let's say that every key leaks 1 bit of the master secret. Right? Then if I pull together a sufficient number of keys, I could recover the entire master secret. So that is why in the setting of an IBE, in the security game, you really want to model this, that the attacker can also receive keys for different identities of its choice. And this is something which makes the proof challenging. So we'll see. Okay, and then the rest of it is sort of similar to the regular PKE. So the attacker gives M0, M1, gets a challenge ciphertext. This is going to be, under the challenge identity ID star, and then it will guess B. And the reduction or the challenger, of course, is going to use the attacker to solve some hard problem, which it received over here. And we'll say that the attacker wins if it can guess the bit B with probability non-negligibly better than half. Okay, so this is the security definition. Yeah?
And is there a reason why the adversary can only request the keys for identities at this one phase?
No. So this is no. So this arrow shows that you can also do it here.
Okay. And before
Good, yeah, that's a great question. So this is actually a weak definition, or weaker definition, I should say, which is called selective security. So selective security means that the challenge should be output by the adversary in the very first step. And if you think this definition is unnatural, it's because it is unnatural. We use it because we don't know how to do the more general case, which is that, the attacker just picks ID star at any point. And by the way, I mean, adaptive security is a big open question in this space. It's been open for more than a decade. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Say it again. Very good question. So let me also repeat the previous question for the sake of the recording. The previous question was why is ID star output at the very beginning rather than at any other point? And the follow-up question is, can you say what makes it hard to handle the ID star being anywhere else in the game? And you will see exactly why in the proof. So let me still give a high-level answer right now. The answer is that, the reduction over here, so I'm using challenger and reduction interchangeably. So the reduction over here needs to, answer key queries for IDs not equal to ID star, and it also needs to embed ID star somehow into the challenge ciphertext. And this turns out to be very challenging to do in general. One way in which we know how to do it is that, if before you even output your public key, if you knew ID star, then you could somehow program information about ID star in your public key, which is what we'll do. Okay, we can program information about ID star in some funny way so that it will work to give you keys for other identities and still allow you to create the challenge ciphertext correctly. So the short answer is just that you'll use ID star in constructing the public parameters. Very good question. Any other questions? Yes?
Why does the attacker get the public key here from the challenger? Shouldn't the attacker be able to calculate it by himself?
No. So this public key is not a public key corresponding to any particular user. It's like the public parameters that are global to the whole system.
Okay.
So thanks for asking this, because this is really important to understand. Okay, so there is a master public key. Let's call it the master public key. And there's a master secret key, right? So this master public key is something that is used by all the users in the system. So that is why it needs to get it from the challenger. Yes? Yes. PP and PK are the same. Sorry about that. Public parameters and public key. Yeah. Okay, so key points of the security model. So first, as I already said, the challenger needs to be able to answer private key queries of the adversary. Note that the challenger should not be able to answer a key query for the challenge ID star. And hence it cannot have the master trapdoor. Can anyone tell me why? So I'm saying that, the challenger, obviously we saw in the previous slide, it does need to answer queries for other identities because the adversary can legitimately request them, but it should not be able to answer it for ID star. Why is that? Any thoughts? Yes?
So they can just decrypt the challenge ciphertext and see which they could decrypt and see which
Exactly.
ones to do this? Yeah.
So because how will it leverage the adversary? right? So if the challenger or the reduction can itself decrypt the challenge ciphertext, then even if it gives it to the adversary and the adversary breaks it without the master secret or anything, there's no way for the challenger to use the adversary's work to break the hard problem that it's trying to break, right? So that's exactly right. That this is the reason it should not be able to answer a query for ID star. And it should be able to generate a challenge ciphertext in a way that the adversary's break is useful, right? So we have the adversary who's going to break IBE for us, and we need to use it to break LWE, right? So it needs to somehow embed LWE into the challenge ciphertext. So these are the things that the proof needs to do. Okay, so now, let's go quickly over Regev's public key encryption scheme. So this is a slight variant of the one that we saw yesterday. This is called the dual Regev PKE, and it was first described in GPV, Gentry, Peikert, and Vaikunthanathan from 2008. So hopefully by now, everybody is an expert on this scheme. But yeah, please stare at it if you need a refresher. So this is the sys problem, right? So AE is equal to U. This is hard to invert when E is short. So I'm going to keep my secret as E, and public parameters will be A and U. Now, in order to encrypt some message, what do I do? Well, I create LWE samples with respect to A and U, and I add the message to one of them. So the message, I'm thinking of it as a scaled bit. Okay, so if it's 0, it's 0. If it's 1, it's Q over 2. And in order to decrypt, I will sort of take the inner product of my short vector E with C0. So that will give me, E transpose A transpose S, which is nothing but U transpose S, and then I'll kind of cancel out this mask. So we can think of C1 as like a mask on the message, and then C0 is a way to cancel out the mask using the secret key. Okay, so the variant of Regev's PKE that we saw yesterday was a little bit different, but hopefully this is fine for everybody. Okay, no questions? Yes?
What happens if I change in the message only one bit?
What?
What happens with the output if I change in the message only one bit? For example, yes or no. So it's equivalent way. Can I decide about the ciphertext what is the plain text? If it's, for example, a Boolean value.
It is Boolean right now, so my message is a bit, but I didn't understand the question. You're saying what happens if I change it from Boolean to non-Boolean?
My question is, what happens if I encrypt the data, any kind of data, for example, and in the plain text I change only one bit between two?
Yeah, it's no problem. So the question is, if I have a longer message and I encrypt again with a very related message, like so maybe first I encrypted the all zeros, and then the next time I encrypted all zeros except for one bit which is set to 1. So the question is what happens? So the answer is nothing should happen. So if LWE is secure, this is completely fine. And the reason is that we assumed no distribution on the messages here. So this is important even for basic PKE. So we assume nothing about the message distribution, right? So we handle any message. Not only if you change one bit. If you encrypt the same message 50 times, right, you still cannot tell. Okay, so we're going to think of A as an encryption matrix, and we already saw that, this noise is going to be small only if E is small. Okay, very good. So let's move on to this, the first IBE that I will show you. And this is by Gentry, Peikert, and Vaikunthanathan, and it's going to be secure in what's called the random oracle model. So now note that I want to embed the vector ID in the ciphertext and the secret key, right? And obviously, I have to generate public parameters independently of ID. We already talked about this. But we should then later somehow be able to morph the encryption into something that is ID dependent. So the idea is going to be this: we're going to continue to do regev encryption actually all throughout. So in all the IBEs, ABEs, in everything that we see, we just do regev encryption. What we work harder now to get is this dependence on ID with all the properties that we want, okay? So here's the idea from GPV. So now I have my public parameters, right? In regev's encryption scheme, my public parameters are A and U. Now I need to run this scheme in some sense many times, once for each identity. So what we're going to do is we're going to think of A as the master public key. Okay, so our setup is going to output this A, and we're going to let this vector U become ID dependent. So what is one very natural way to make the vector U be ID dependent? It's that, I'll just choose my, my U as hash of ID, where H here is a hash function, and it is modeled as something called a random oracle. Now here's another quick question. How many of you have seen the random oracle before? Okay, so there's also several of you who haven't. So this morning I made a slide for that. Okay, so we'll talk about it. So what we want to do is we want to perform, regev's public key encryption scheme with these ID dependent parameters. Okay, that's going to be our basic template. And let's briefly look at the random oracle model in which this scheme is going to be secure. So first of all, here, when I said let UID be H of ID, there are a bunch of assumptions I made. So one thing is that, in the real world, this H is just going to be a hash function, okay, with the appropriate range. So with the appropriate domain and range. So it will take whatever is the, bit string that you have as identity, and it will hash it into a vector from the appropriate space. So we were using ZQ to the n yesterday. So this hash function is going to do that. And now the random oracle model, which is a very famous model in cryptography, assumes that a well-chosen hash function such as SHA-3 behaves like a random function. So what this means is that it's assuming that, this hash function is going to, on any input, give me a random output. So it's behaving like a totally random function. Okay, so on any input, it gives a random output. This is an assumption, right? Because H is going to be a concrete hash function in the real world. So we are assuming that, this is actually behaving like a random function. If I query it on the same input many times, I get the same output. Okay? And this is very useful in practical schemes because it kind of gives you a source of public randomness. So everybody has access to this hash function. If I just say H of ID, H is a public function, so anybody can compute H of ID. Okay, so this is something which is very useful in practical schemes. And in cryptographic proofs, it ends up being very useful, as we'll see. It allows us to, this random oracle model kind of allows us to somehow program this hash function in the proof. So this is something that we'll see in today's proof. Are there any questions about the random oracle model for those who haven't seen it before? Make sense? So it's, just think of H as, a random function. And it's called an oracle because I query it with any input and I get a random output. Okay? Okay, good. So we're finally ready to see the IBE scheme. So as I already said, we just want to do regev encryption, right, with this. So our key is going to be a small vector EID such that A times EID is equal to UID. Right, because this was the basic equation for regev decryption that we used. So the question is, how do I compute this key? Any ideas? Yeah. this is actually exactly right. So what you said is exactly right. So what he said is that you set up the A so that you know the trapdoor. And in fact, this works perfectly because we already saw yesterday that we can find an A such that A looks random, but it has a trapdoor. The trapdoor exactly allows me to invert these one-way functions, right? And that this is a one-way function that I want to invert. So here I have some arbitrary U, and I can invert it using a trapdoor for A to get this short vector, and that's all I need. I mean, so now I can go ahead and do my encryption and decryption just as I was doing before. Okay, so to spell it out, right, the public key or the public parameters are the matrix A. The master secret is the trapdoor for A. Okay, now in order to derive a key for some identity, I will set the corresponding U vector to be hash of the ID, and then I'll use the trapdoor to find a short E such that A times EID is UID. And the rest of it is exactly the same, right? So the encryption will work exactly as before, again using UID as H of ID. So note already how the random oracle, or let's just think of the hash function, how the hash function has already helped me here, because the extract algorithm and the encrypt algorithm could both compute UID without any communication. Right? So it gave me a way to map ID to a vector U, which was public. Okay? So this is my encryption, and decryption is just as before. So is the scheme clear to everybody? Okay, so great. So let's look at the proof. Okay, so the proof is really important. So as we already discussed, we're thinking about the selective game, in which we know ID star from the very beginning. And what we need the challenger to do is to answer key queries for any ID which is not equal to ID star, be unable to answer the key query for ID star, and embed the LWE challenge into the challenge ciphertext for ID star. So these are the three things that the challenger needs to do. Okay, so first let's look at, how will it embed LWE into the challenge ciphertext. So what does it do? Well, so, it needs to receive an LWE challenge from the LWE, from the LWE challenger, right? And it receives the following. So either it receives AS plus noise and US plus noise, or it receives A random and U random, right? That's the LWE challenge, isn't it? So the IBE challenger is going to receive either a real LWE sample or a truly random LWE sample, okay? And what does it do? So now it wants to use this U in the challenge ciphertext, right? So now note, how did we construct the ciphertext? What was the U in the ciphertext? It was H of ID, wasn't it? But now the challenger has given me this U. So I need it to somehow be the case that H of ID star is equal to the U that I received from the challenger. And the random oracle actually allows me to do this programming. So I can just maintain a table where I say that, okay, H of ID star, I'm going to set it as this U. Okay? And if I do that, then I can use the LWE challenge in order to create my challenge ciphertext. So now I sample a random bit B, and I set my challenge ciphertext exactly using the LWE sample and adding to it the bit B, right? So the adversary sees exactly the LWE challenge. If it received random, right, if it received a random sample, then the message bit B is information theoretically hidden. and the attacker has no advantage, so it cannot solve the challenge with probability better than half. If it does solve the challenge with probability better than half, then this must mean that I received the real sample and the attacker has somehow broken LWE. Okay, so this is the way that I will embed my LWE challenge into the challenge ciphertext so that the attacker's success in guessing the bit from the challenge ciphertext translates into my success in breaking the LWE challenge. Does that make sense? Okay. And now how do I handle key queries, right? So we need to answer key queries for any ID not equal to ID star. So the way that we do this is that for any other ID, we sample our own secret key. So the challenger will sample its own secret key EID and set UID as A times EID. And again, it will just program H of ID to be this UID. Now recall from yesterday that UID is random, right? So therefore this programming makes sense. And now if the attacker queries the oracle, the hash oracle on ID, then I return UID. And if I query for a key for the identity ID, then I return EID. You see what we did? So we just sampled the key EID and the UID all by ourselves. We saw yesterday how you can generate the same distribution going forward or backward, right? So in the real world, in the real algorithm, you're using the trapdoor for A to sample the EID in the reverse way, right? In the proof, we're going in the forward way. So we're sampling the EID, setting the UID, and then the UID, which needs to be consistent with the random oracle, we program the random oracle such that H of ID is UID. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes?
And how does sampling EID instead of UID help us in the proof?
Say again?
How does it help us in the proof that we sample EID instead of UID and then reverting?
So the question is, how does it help us in the proof that we sample EID? The point is that in the proof, I, the challenger, need to be able to return a secret key for ID. I have no way, if I just compute UID as H of ID, right, without a trapdoor for A, I have no way of sampling this EID. So the main point is that I cannot have the trapdoor for A. Why? Because A is part of the LWE challenge. So obviously, I mean, I have no trapdoor for A, right? So that is why. Any other questions? Okay, so this was the first construction from lattices in the random oracle model. And what if I don't want to assume the random oracle, right? So the random oracle proof is a great first step, but this is in general unrealistic. So first of all, there are a bunch of results that show that, in general, the random oracle is uninstantiable. I don't want to go into details of this, but there are some contrived counterexamples that show that for any hash function that you use to model your random oracle, you can find attacks on the underlying scheme. And from the more mathematical perspective, the reason that people don't like the random oracle model is that it kind of sidesteps the whole challenge in the proof, right? So it's giving you an exponential space in which you can program things as per your wish. So what we saw in this proof is that we have this table and we're able to sample our own EID, compute our UID and set it accordingly in this table, right? So in the real world, of course, there is no such table that exists. So it's unclear how you would get a proof that works without the help of the random oracle. Okay, so this is the key technical challenge. And the question that we'll answer next is, can we construct it without the random oracle? And of course, the answer to this is yes. So once again, we want to embed this vector ID in the ciphertext and the secret key. And now what we're going to do is a little bit different from what we did before. Okay, so in the GPV scheme, what we did is that, our matrix A was fixed throughout the scheme, and it was the U that kept changing depending on the identity. Right? Now what we'll do is actually we'll stop messing with the U, and what we'll do is we'll start letting this matrix A, the encryption matrix in regev's PKE, we'll start allowing that to depend on the identity. So we'll let this matrix be publicly computable from the public parameters, and we'll do encryption with that. Okay, so now we need to find a way to compute a short vector E such that FID times E is congruent to U mod Q. Okay, good. So these are our public parameters. So we have two matrices A0, A1. G, of course, is our famous gadget matrix. It's fixed, so it need not be in the public key, but I mean, I just wrote it here so that everyone remembers that we have it. Our master secret key is again going to be a trapdoor for A0. And now for the identity ID, I'm going to set my FID, my ID-dependent matrix as A0 concatenated with A1 plus ID times G. Okay, so this actually should remind you of, the matrices we were constructing yesterday. We'll see the connection more closely, right? When we were randomizing G to A, we were building a matrix similar. There we were calling the A0, we were calling it B, right? And we said it's B and G minus BR. So what we're doing here is a little bit similar. The A1 can be thought of as A0 times R. Okay, we'll see this more closely in the proof. But for now, we're defining our ID-based matrix in this way. And now the key, as usual, needs to be this short E such that FID times E is congruent to U mod Q. So now, how should I sample this? Any thoughts? So far what we've seen is a way to sample a short vector given a trapdoor for the whole matrix, right? So if I had a trapdoor for FID, then I would be in good shape and I could sample this. But I don't have a trapdoor for the whole of FID, I only have a trapdoor for A0. What should I do?
You can separate E into two parts. And the first part is E1, second part is E2. You can choose arbitrary E2 and then sample E1 by the trapdoor of A0.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So what he's suggesting is that you can separate E into two parts, E1 and E2, corresponding to the first part, which is A0, and the second part. So if I write FID in this way, right, and I break E into E1 and E2, then the equation that I get is A0 E0 plus this second term times E1 is congruent to U, right? And then what I can do is I can just sample E2 as I please, and then take that whole term to the other side. And that will give me A0 times, so now I need to sample E0 such that A times E0 gives me whatever I need. Does that make sense? So the idea is just that I break E into E1 and E2, right, and take the E2 dependent term on the other side of the equation, and then use the trapdoor for A0. Yeah?
What is the assumption on the space of the IDs now?
So, yeah, good question. So one thing that I've brushed under the carpet is, what is this ID looking like? So I deliberately did not want to go into this, but in general, we can think of the identity as, a bit string of polynomial length. So if lambda is the security parameter, think of the ID as a lambda bit string. And in this slide, and in fact in the rest of the talk, when I write ID, this is actually an encoding of ID. It's, so there's a function that will map the bit string to a matrix here. Okay, so for now, don't worry too much about the exact shape of the ID, but indeed that is something that needs to be handled. For the purpose of this talk, you can even just think of the ID as a scalar. But we will in fact use a function to map it, not like a random hash function or anything like that, but like a explicit function. Okay, so what we discussed was that, if I'm given a trapdoor for A0, I can actually use that to extend the trapdoor to any extended matrix like this, right? So if I have A0 concatenated with anything, I can use the trapdoor for A0 to get a trapdoor for the whole thing. Okay, so this is what we saw. So now how will my encryption proceed? It's, once again, it's the same thing. So the difficult part was to figure out how to define FID. And this is really the core thing, which we will see in the proof. So we wanted to embed the identity into this matrix, right? And that was the core thing that, that was the core challenge. Having defined it in this way, the rest of it is simple. So, it's just doing encryption like we know how to do. We also saw how to do key derivation using our extended trapdoor. So the rest of it is just going to be like regev decryption. Are there any questions about the correctness of the scheme? Yeah?
So if you just step a few split E into E1 and E2, would you only be able to find E1 rather than, because you only have a trapdoor for A0?
No, so there's no board here, but no. So what we're doing is thanks for asking this because it's really important. For a moment, this A1 plus IDG, let me call it A1 prime, okay, for a moment. So now what do I have? I have A0, A1 prime. This is my matrix. And I need an E such that A0, A1 prime times E is U. So what we'll do is we'll also break E into two parts, E1 and E2. So now I have the equation A0, E1 plus A1 prime E2 is equal to U. This is my equation. Now what I'm saying is, it doesn't matter what U is for the purpose of my trapdoor sampling. So I will simply sample E2 just without any constraints. It will just be of the right distribution. It will not need any trapdoor. I'll just sample it. It could lead to any value. So A1 prime times E2 is anything. It's, U prime. And now I will compute U minus U prime. And now I need A0 E1 to be U minus U prime. But this I can solve.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah?
So do you want this E to be short?
Yes.
But so how do you know that if you chose a short E2, then the trapdoor will produce smaller E1?
Because that is, the question is that how will you guarantee that the vector E is short? And the answer is that it's a guarantee given to me by the trapdoor. So E2 is something I sampled on my own. I can sample it short, right? And E1 is something that I sampled using the trapdoor. And the trapdoor is able to invert the function, right? So the trapdoor is able to solve the sys problem. So that means the trapdoor can compute for me a short, well-distributed E1 such that A0 E1 is U minus U prime. Does that convince you? What's the doubt? I mean, I can tell you it's correct. So, yeah. What's the question?
Okay, so if you So the trapdoor has this property.
Yes.
Short to short.
Yeah, the trapdoor exactly has the property that it can find a short pre-image. Because if it were not finding a short pre-image, it did not need to be a trapdoor, right? I mean, if I were to just ask you to sample FID, if I were to ask you to give me an E, such that FID times E is equal to U mod Q, I claim all of us can do it trivially. If there is no bound on the size of E, on the shortness of E, then just Gaussian elimination will do it, right? Add random, make FID square, for instance, and then just invert. Is it clear to everyone? So this was actually, maybe it's worth going back. This was actually the very first slide of today's presentation. How do I, what? Okay, maybe I'm creating more problems than solving. Sorry. Okay. This was the very first slide of today's presentation, right? That I have a way to compute a trapdoor to a given matrix. So the A here is our A0 currently, such that it allows me to invert LWE and SIS. So in particular SIS, which means that, I can find a short vector such that A0 times E1 in our case is whatever I want. It maps to anything that I want. Okay, so, sorry. Yeah.
Does it mean that you're now using like both LWE and SIS as functions?
So no, actually, I mean, this is, it turns out no, just LWE will suffice. We'll see that in the proof. Sorry, let me try to get rid of this annoying warning over here. Okay. Okay, good. So this is where we are, right? And hopefully by now everybody is convinced that, at least correctness works. So why is it secure? That's something that we need to see, but at least correctness works. Okay? So good. So now, let's look at the proof strategy. Now let my challenge ID be ID star. Okay, now again, I cannot have a basis for A0, right, for the same reason as before. But, here's my gadget magic again. So I have a basis for G. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set A1 in this way. A0R minus ID star times G. This is uniform by the leftover hash lemma, right? We saw this yesterday. So AR plus anything G is uniform by the leftover hash lemma. R, let me remind you, is a random low norm matrix. And recall this, in the bubble over here we have FID. This is the definition of FID. So FID is therefore going to work out to be A0 concatenated with A0R plus ID minus ID star G. Does everyone agree with this? What did I do? I'm just and this is answering, you know, one of the questions from the back right at the beginning. Like, why did we need the selective security definition? So note that I'm embedding ID star into my public parameter. Okay, so I'm computing my A1 dependent on ID star in this way, right, in this way. And FID is therefore going to work out to be this. Now, one thing to immediately notice is that if ID is equal to ID star, then actually this G goes away. Okay, and I have no trapdoors anymore. So I did not yet tell you how will I use G to sample, you know, short keys according to this matrix. But at the very least, we can already notice that when ID is equal to ID star, this whole thing, this whole term dies. Right? And there is no trapdoor anywhere. So a lot of people are looking confused. Is there a question? So the main thing I just did in this step is I set A1. I am the challenger, right? I'm constructing the public key. You, the attacker, gave me ID star. I have to give you the public key. And what I'm doing is I'm choosing my public key to be dependent on ID star, just as I said that I would, right? And the way that I'm letting it depend on ID is via this matrix here. So A1, I'm going to define it in a special way. Now notice that in the real world, this A1 was chosen uniformly random. Here we're programming it to have this special algebraic structure. However, what we already saw yesterday is that this specially designed matrix nevertheless looks random. We already saw this yesterday. Right? Yeah?
So just to clarify, this is different from before? We don't have a trapdoor for A0? This is like a different construction?
It's not a different construction. It's the proof of the same construction. So I showed you the construction. Okay, thanks for asking this. So I showed you the construction. I need to argue that it's secure. Right? So we went over this proof strategy for the GPV IBE, right? Where we said that, look, the challenger should be able to answer queries for ID not equal to ID star and should not be able to answer the query for ID star, right? And should be able to embed an LWE challenge within the challenge ciphertext. These were the three things that we wanted. And now what I'm trying to show you is how will I make this work in the standard model where you don't have a random oracle to help you, right? So in order to answer the queries of the adversary, I'm choosing my matrix A in a special way. And that is what I'm trying to show. So yeah, it's not a different, it's the same scheme, but this is the proof. So I'm changing things in the proof in a way that allows me to do what I want. And note that whatever changes I make should be indistinguishable to the adversary. So in particular, in the real world, I picked my A1 randomly, right? So where's my A1? So here's my A1. This is my A1 in the real world. This was just chosen uniformly. In fact, it did not even have a trapdoor. But now in the proof, I cannot have a trapdoor for A0. But I need some way to sample sys solutions, right? Because I need to give you keys for FID where ID is not equal to ID star. Does that make sense? Right? So I'm spending a lot of time on this proof. Like I said, even at the expense of showing ABE, like I could have shown all the constructions. So correctness is much easier to see. But I think that the core innovation is, making the proof work. So that's why I'm trying to spend time in really explaining the main ideas of the proof. Okay? So now, once again, we cannot have a trapdoor for A0. Okay? And also, if we had a trapdoor for A1, also it wouldn't help us. Okay? So what we are doing is we're choosing A1 in this special way. That's all we did. This is the first step of the proof. Okay, I'm embedding my challenge ID star into my public parameters by choosing my A1 in this special way, and then having chosen A1 in this way, I'm merely observing that FID becomes this. Right? So my identity dependent matrix, which I'm using for my encryption, it starts looking like this. And the next observation I'm making is that when ID is equal to ID star, the G dies. Now note that the G is the only matrix around here on the slide, right, in this place where there is a trapdoor. Nothing, the only other matrix that we have is A0, and we don't have a trapdoor for that. So we only have a trapdoor for G. So if we did not yet talk about how to sample keys when I have a trapdoor for G. But we can at least notice that when ID is ID star, I no longer have a trapdoor even for G. Right? I have no trapdoors anymore. So for FID star, it just looks like A0, A0R. And there is no way for me to give you keys for this. Okay? So this is just what I wanted to notice. Now I need to find a basis for FID, and I need to use this, do this given a basis for G. Right? So remember the takeaway from yesterday, right, which we've been looking at again and again. Right? So here what we do is notice, right, that this FID actually looks the same as this, right? So it's just that the notation is different. But when ID is not equal to ID star, then my FID actually has the same form as this matrix that we saw yesterday, which we said that we can find a trapdoor for. So we already saw yesterday in great detail how to go from a trapdoor for G to a trapdoor to a matrix that has this form. And now what I'm showing you is that actually this FID, when ID is not equal to ID star, has the same form as this. Do you see that? Right, so this is G minus, A0 times R, right? This is something times G plus A0 times R. So plus minus, anyway, it will not matter, right? And scaling it also will not matter. I did not argue that, but let's ignore that for now. Okay, so this technique was developed in ABB 10 and in fact was generalized into a general trapdoor sampling algorithm in MP12. Okay, so this way, using this trapdoor sampling that we saw yesterday, so what is happening is that in my proof, I'm essentially going from G to a matrix for which I can have a trapdoor, something that we saw yesterday, right? We're doing that in the proof over here. We have G and we have A0, right? And in yesterday's discussion, we saw that, we sample this B and then we set A to be this. Now, in our case now, A0 will be given to us by the LWE challenger. We have no control on it. But it doesn't matter because I did not need anything special from this A0. I will simply set my FID in this particular way. Again, argue using leftover hash lemma that this FID looks random, right? And use the techniques from yesterday to compute a trapdoor for FID. And note again that the trapdoor vanishes when ID is equal to ID star. So here is what goes on. Okay, let's try to compare how things look in the real world versus the proof. So the public parameters are A0, A1, and G. Right? In the real system, the master secret is a trapdoor for A0. In the simulation, the trapdoor is R. Okay? A1 is random in the real system. In the simulation, it is constructed in this way. right? And these are indistinguishable since R is low norm random by the leftover hash lemma, which we again saw yesterday, right? The encryption matrix is the same, but because of the specially chosen A1, it factors into this, this equation here. And the secret key is the same. So the main difference is that in the left world, we used a trapdoor for A0 to sample the short vector. In the right world, we used G, the trapdoor for G, and the knowledge of R to sample the short vector. Is it clear? Okay, and in the real world, the master secret allows me to generate a key for any identity, whereas in the simulation, I can only generate keys for ID not equal to ID star. Okay? So a word on the matrix R. This is a bit redundant since we already saw it yesterday. It's just that it needs to be sort of, it needs to be low norm for sure. You can think of it as being Gaussian, or you could think of it as being even binary, as long as the matrix R is big enough, right? So think of it, let's say, as a square matrix. By the leftover hash lemma, we can say that A0R looks random, right? And yeah, LHL roughly says that R has enough entropy to make A0R look like A1. We already saw this in depth yesterday. So are there any questions? So I hope that the high-level proof strategy was clear, okay? And it sort of very, it uses the ideas that we saw yesterday in a very crucial way. Okay, so let's try to generalize this construction now. So now let's handle inner products and more general circuits. So we know how to make this work when the encryptor or the ciphertext has an ID and the keygen also has an ID and the two match, then decryption works. Now what we would like to do is generalize this functionality, okay? So what we would like to do is embed a vector y in the key and a vector x in the ciphertext. And we would like decryption to work if x inner product y is 0 and not otherwise. Okay. More generally, going forward, what we will want to build, and this will use ideas that were developed in Hotek's talk yesterday, so depending on if we have time to get to it, we would like the key to have some function f, and we would like the ciphertext to have some input x, and decryption should work if f of x is 1. Okay, and not otherwise. So we'll start slowly. We'll do it just for inner product, just for the inner product functionality. So here f is just a vector, and I'm just going to check if the vectors are orthogonal or not. And then we'll warm up and start handling multiplication, and then addition and multiplication together will allow us to handle all circuits. By the way, inner products are useful even in themselves, but maybe it's not, we need not go there. Okay, so good. So let's see how to generalize the construction we saw to inner products. Okay, so here are my public parameters. So for attribute length 4, okay, I will have 4 matrices, A1 to A4, and I'll also have my favorite matrices A and U. Now, the master secret key will, again, no surprises, be a trapdoor for A. And now what I'll do is that this matrix that I use for encryption, right, that I will define in this way. So it will be A concatenated with summation of yi ai, where y is the vector for which I'm creating the key. Okay, so now in order to derive a key for the vector y, I need to solve this equation, right, with a short solution. So it's A summation yi ai times ei congruent to u. And how will I do this? Once again, just as before, I have the trapdoor for A. So therefore, I can solve this for any extended extension of A as well. Okay, so I can derive the key. Everybody believes that, right? Okay, so this is my key. Now, in order to encrypt for a vector x, these are my usual ciphertext components, right? US plus noise and AS plus noise. The first term will hide the message as before. Now I need to encode these x's as well, right? So for that, I compute these extra terms, Ci, as AI plus Xig transpose S plus noise. Okay, so this is the way that I compute my ciphertext. Okay, any ideas how to do decryption? Can you tell me how to decrypt? So it's going to be Regev decryption, but I need to get to a place where I can apply the key. And decryption should only work if, you know, summation xi yi is 0. So what should I do?
That's a question. I'm not sure if I understood the setting here with the x and y, how they come into play. They kind of replace the IDs now, or?
Okay, so thanks for asking this again. So what we're doing now is that the ciphertext again has, you know, some string x attached to it, and the key again has some string attached to it. Previously, we were decrypting if the two strings were exactly equal. Now we are saying we want to decrypt if the inner product of these two strings is 0. So it's a generalization. You can see, I mean, it's worth checking later that if you can solve this, you can also solve the IBE, right? Just by appending -1 and 1, right? So if I have ID, okay, whatever. So basically, we are generalizing IBE to this functionality. Okay, and what I was telling us was that this is my new, you know, my new key. So I'm now replacing the encryption matrix from before, right, with, you know, with this. It's interesting because the encryptor does not actually have fy, right, because fy depends on y. So we will try to, the encryptor will try to give you things that allow you to get sfy plus noise. So let's just, you know, stare at fy. And the key for this, you know, for this y is going to be a short ey such that this matrix times this is u mod q. Is it clear? And now, in order to encrypt, I give you this. And what I was asking you is how to decrypt. Any thoughts? If this is my ciphertext and I'm given y and e sub y, then how can I go about decrypting? So again, I want to just perform, you know, Regev decryption, but I need to match the key to the ciphertext, right? The key was for this other matrix, and I need to kind of manipulate the ciphertext to hit that matrix. So can you suggest how to do it? And the hint is that decryption should work if x inner product y is 0. So I have all these things with x in it, right? And I want to get to a place where I compute x inner product y. So what's a natural thing to do? Exactly. So, just compute summation of yici, right? And that will give me what? Summation yiai plus summation yixig s plus, that y in a product noise. Let's assume that the y is binary for simplicity, so the noise doesn't blow up too much. So now this has given me, right, so this has given me this term, right, as per your suggestion. So the next thing to notice is that, well, if the inner product is 0, then this term goes away. And now I have summation yiais plus noise, and I have as plus noise. So I can concatenate them to get a summation yiais plus noise, and this exactly is the thing for which I have the key. You see? So I manipulated the ciphertext, and this is a precursor to what happens for more general functions. See, at the time that I'm encrypting, I just have my X. I have no idea what key is going to be applied to it, right? So all I can do is encode my X in some nice way, so that later, when the decryptor knows the Y, or more generally another function F, we'll see if we get there, but when the decryptor, knowing Y, given these encodings of X, can find a way to compute the matrix that was used in the key. So in all of lattice-based crypto, right, this is what we do. You want to manipulate these encodings, right, to hit the matrix that the key generator computed. The key generator did not know X, but it knew Y. So it's encoded Y in some way. And you should be able to manipulate your encodings to sort of get an LWE sample with the same matrix that the key generator chose. Does that make sense? So this gives me a summation yiais plus noise, and this is exactly what we have the key for, so now I can perform Regev decryption. So let's quickly generalize this to circuits. Okay, so this will be faster because Hotek showed us a lot of this machinery yesterday. So as I was saying, my ciphertext will just have to encode the xi, right? By the way, maybe I should first define what I mean by generalizing for circuits. So what I want to do now is that the ciphertext again just encodes X. But the key can encode something more than a linear function. In fact, I would like the key to encode any circuit. Okay, and in the spirit of what Hotek showed us yesterday, it suffices to support addition and multiplication, right? Now, addition we already saw. We just saw the inner product construction, which in particular implies addition, right? So it remains to handle multiplication. And this is something we already saw yesterday. So we're going to use the same equation that we saw yesterday to also solve this problem. Okay, so my ciphertext remains the same as in the previous slide. And previously I could, evaluate on these ciphertext encodings to obtain, something like AY plus inner product XYG, the whole S plus noise, right? And when X inner product Y is 0, then this translates into a ciphertext that only encodes F, for which the key generator could compute the matching key, right? And this is what I want to generate to an arbitrary F. So I would like now to be able to go from encodings of X to an encoding of any F of X. And didn't we see how to do this yesterday? Right? So this was the equation that Hotek showed us. I'll show it to you again. but I mean, this was the equation that Hotek showed us. Okay, so let's just look at a toy example. Okay, so I have x1 and x2, and I want to compute an encoding of x1 times x2. Okay, so I have C1 as A1 plus X1G S plus noise. So this is just an encoding of x1. This is an encoding of x2, and I want to somehow get an encoding of x1, x2. This is what I want. So note that, you know, I can use X in doing this evaluation. So here is my first, my first matrix. Now, if I multiply my first matrix with G inverse minus A2, right, and I multiply my second matrix with X1, right, and then I add these, then this term goes away. Right, so you can see that this has something minus x1a2, and this has x1a2 plus x1x2g, and this is what I wanted. So the last term is what I want. I don't want the middle terms, but luckily for me they cooperate with each other and they kill each other. Sorry. And this one encodes the function, okay, the product of x1 and x2. So I get, you know, sum A12 plus x1, x2g. Right? We saw this yesterday, but yeah, we're seeing it again. So now I need to do the same stuff within LWE. So now there's also this S plus noise, right? But nothing that I did was blowing up norm, right? So G1 inverse minus A2 and X1 are both small, and they don't blow up the noise. So what I can do is I can apply the same transformation from the previous slide to compute A12 plus X1 X2G times S plus noise, right? Because whatever I showed in the previous slide, I can also do the same thing if there's also a noise term, because it's not blowing up the noise. So anyway, I mean, I don't want to spend far too much time on this. So, you know, what we saw is that, well, again, if x1, x2 is 0, then I can get A concatenated with A12 S plus noise. So, you know, the x1, x2 G term will go away, get cancelled if x1 times x2 is 0. And then I can perform Regev decryption as usual. So let's not worry too much about the details. Maybe it's worth just very quickly summarizing what we did here, right? So maybe this is a good slide to stare at. So what we said was that, you know, when I encode my X in this particular way, by the way, this particular encoding is very famous in lattice-based crypto because it's very, very amenable to computation. What we said is that if we encode our X, vector X, in this particular way, then fine. Previously, we just saw how to compute linear functions on it. But we can also compute products on it, as we saw in the next slide and as we also saw in yesterday's talk, right? And this is by multiplying G inverse minus A2 to the first encoding and multiplying X1 to the second encoding and adding the two. So then we end up with sum A plus f of x G. Now if f of x is 0, then once again you will end up with A sub f S plus noise, and this is something that the key generator could give you a key for. Are there any questions? So this was the thing that we saw. Okay, so this is the main thing that allowed us to handle multiplication. Are there any questions? Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I mean, I don't think, I'm quite sure that we cannot do the proof. Yeah, maybe it's good to end on this slide. So, we saw this yesterday, right? That basically these encodings times a low norm matrix allow me to get, A sub f, like some encoding of the function on the matrices minus f of xg. So when f of x is 0, this whole term goes away. This term becomes, let's just call it A sub f. And this is something for which the key generator can give me a key. Okay, so I can manipulate the encodings to hit the matrix that the key generator encoded f in. And this allows me to perform regev decryption. So let's stop here. Yeah. Let's stop here.
Thanks.
Are there any questions?
Yes. Yes, there's a question over there.
So I was wondering, so for the functionality, for the inner product case, you didn't need a particular form of G. You could have used any matrix.
No, for the proof you need it.
For your proof, you need
Yeah.
it. And for general circuits, you even need it for the
Yeah.
functionality. Okay, thanks.
So actually, wait. So you need a matrix with a trapdoor. So I mean, G is convenient, but you could also use a different G hat or B or whatever, as long as you have a trapdoor for it.
The smallest you only need for general.
The smallness you need everywhere when you do the G inverse thing. So you need to ensure that the noise does not blow up. Oh, I think you're saying that you don't need the smallness if you just do addition. Yeah, that's true. But you will need the trapdoor. So, in some sense, like the trapdoor and the smallness are in some sense the same thing. Yeah.
Any more questions to Shweta? There's a question over there. Wait for the mic, please.
So I asked in the middle of the talk, I asked if we need both SIS and LWE. Actually, I meant the very first IBE scheme, but maybe I still, because it just seemed to me like if we could break SIS, we could break the first IBE scheme. But
Yeah, but the thing is that we, like in the proof, we did not need SIS. So, SIS and LWE, as we have seen, are really the same problem.
Yeah.
And in this particular proof, in all of these proofs, we don't need to get an SIS challenge. So we don't rely on the hardness of SIS. Where it comes in the proof is that, you remember we were sampling these short images and then setting the right-hand side appropriately, right? So, so I mean that's where it features in the proof, but you did not need an SIS challenger to give you something which you could invert.
couldn't I get the secret keys if I can break SIS, or maybe I'm...
No, so what I'm trying to say is that the SIS hardness is somehow already encoded in the LWE hardness. We don't need a hardness for that range of parameters here.
Okay, thank you.
In the proof, but your intuition is correct, and I mean I presented that intuition in the construction, but we did not we did not explicitly need it in the proof.
Thank you.